Thanks. All right, so for those of you I don't know, I'm Megan. I'm an R3. I was actually originally planning to do a talk on nephrology because that's my favorite thing. But then I saw 2 weeks ago, there was a whole morning on nephrology from true experts. So I actually switched gears to talk about a project I worked on in medical school that has sort of been put on the back burner during residency. But it's about learning how to listen. I have no disclosures for this project. And the goals of this are really to think about your own journey of listening, recognize experiences in your life that may have contributed to how you listen, consider ongoing practices about how to be a better listener, and just take some time today to focus on a humanistic aspect of our daily work instead of hearing another talk about dialysis physics, which is also really cool, but not for today. So just as a way of introduction, I used to be a professional musician. This is how I got interested in this in the first place. I started playing violin when I was 7 years old. I switched to the viola, which is just a little bit of a bigger violin, when I was 13, and I actually went to college and grad school for music performance on viola. And then I worked professionally for 3 years, mostly in New York City, before starting my post-bac at NYU and deciding to go to medical school. And in the process of applying from post-bac to med school to residency, I spoke and had to write a lot of personal statements about why I was doing what I was doing and how I thought my musical background contributed to medicine and how things related. So I did a lot of thinking about things in my musical life that would translate well to medicine. And before I started med school, a lot of that was like, I spent a lot of hours in the practice room, and we've all studied for all the steps now. We know how helpful that could be to learn how to focus like that. Just the dedication to a craft, the feeling like you're being called to do something for your career, everything sort of felt like it translated. And then once I actually started medical school, and I remember the very first day of medical school, we did like a practice OSCE, and I was thinking about the patient interview. And it really felt like music to me, like how I listened to people when I played music. And then as medical school went on, I realized we weren't really talking about how to actually listen to our patients. We were talking about how to be humanistic doctors, but the actual focus of listening and how we do that was kind of left out. And so I was thinking a lot about my experience as a chamber musician, which is what my job was for the 3 years before I went to post-bac. And because not everybody is as into music as I am, if you don't know what chamber music is, it's music that's composed for very small groups of musicians. So anywhere from about 2 to maybe 10 to 12 musicians. And originally it was actually meant to be played by amateurs in large rooms. It was very intimate. If you can believe it, people would just have like parties where they play chamber music for each other. And then over the years, it sort of shifted towards being something that was done more in concert halls and more formally. I think this is probably debatable, but most classical musicians would agree that the string quartet is the most revered form of chamber music. It has 2 violins, 1 viola, 1 cello. And most composers wrote many, many string quartets because there's just something really special about that combination of instruments. It's been described as a marriage. It's a very intimate experience to play quartets, especially with the same members of the quartet over time. And Goethe actually described it as 4 rational people conversing. I guess the rational part is debatable depending on the quartet. But that was my job for 3 years. A lot of really, really intimate experiences with the same people playing what I think is some of like the greatest music composed. So I was thinking more about translating my experience, and it's when I first told the dean of my music school that I was going to go to medical school and I needed a recommendation letter from him, I was really nervous. And his response was, "This seems like a very natural transition. Everything you've done in music will translate to your career in medicine." And so thinking about that, it really is true. Like when you learn to read music, it's learning a new language completely. And if you guys remember the first 6 months of medical school, you're learning the biochemistry, the genetics, all of these like cellular building blocks, literally, of the human body. And then in music, you take that knowledge and you start to learn scales and etudes, and you do repetition of all these things until it becomes natural. And in medical school, we're building our differential diagnosis, our illness scripts with all of these things we've learned in those first 6 months. And then the listening part, I realize, is sort of that last step. Once you have the building blocks and the technique and the practice, you actually have to go in and you still have to listen and hear what all the other players around you are doing. And in medicine, that felt like you have all this knowledge, then you go in to interview the patient and you have no idea what they're going to say or what they're going to do. And you really have to actively listen to what's going on with all of this knowledge in your head as well. And so in medical school, I started thinking a lot about this, and I actually did a project to sort of look into it more. So I was looking into what has been done in terms of teaching the patient interview, in terms of how we evaluate people on how they actually listen and how well they're doing at listening. And this is a little bit of a bias because Mac Lipkin is a doctor at NYU, where I went to medical school, but he's a really wonderful primary care doctor. And he wrote a book in the 90s about the medical interview. And he talked about the importance of communicating these 4 things: interest, respect, support, and empathy. And then in his book, there's a lot of data, which seems obvious, but active listening is associated with satisfaction. The more you actively listen to your patients, the more your patients are going to be satisfied. It seems obvious. We think of our AHD grading, there's always a box for active listening, empathetic statements, things like that. So then in the early 2000s, there was actually an active listening observation scale developed. It was developed to measure the perceived or observed frequency of active listening enacted by physicians during patient consultations. And what they did is they videotaped 500 PCP interactions about minor ailments. And I thought it was interesting why they chose minor ailments, because they said if there's the absence of serious physical symptoms or maybe serious physical exam findings, you really did have to focus more on what the patient was telling you and less on sort of the objective data that you might have from the medical chart or from labs or imaging. I think it also is interesting that for a lot of us, I know these minor physical ailments where you really do have to actively listen are harder for us to think about and diagnose in the primary care setting, at least for me. It just relies more on the patient's testimony and description of what's going on. So they had 14 sort of measures of active listening that they started the research with. And then as they went on, they tested the hypotheses of whether these hypotheses were actually valid and if they did make patients feel like they were being more actively listened to. They ended up only validating 7 of them, which are listed here. So they call it the active listening observation scale. And the 7 that they validated were: 1, the practitioner shows not to be distracted during the consultation. They are not offhand or hasty. They listen attentively. They give patient time and space to present the problem. They use exploring questions. They're good at leading the conversation, and they express understanding non-verbally. And so I think if you think of our sort of OSCE grading scales, they're pretty similar to this. I remember seeing checkboxes on the OSCE of listen attentively, not interrupting the patient, which you could think of as giving patient time and space to present the problem, using open-ended questions, using exploring questions, and then sort of the nonverbal communication that they're looking for as well. So I sort of took the active listening observation scale and thought about which feature that Dr. Lipkin felt was really important to communicate to patients was sort of proven by one of these things on the active listening observation scale. And I think showing interest is just listening attentively. And I think my sort of issue with the phrase listens attentively is that's so subjective. And that's sort of the whole thing, is how do we actually listen attentively and how do we decide that someone is listening attentively? It seems like a really big, broad thing to just say, oh yeah, they were listening to me. And then for respect, I think it's showing not to be distracted. I think focusing on the patient, I think we all know that that's a way we show respect in patient interviews and in any sort of communication in our life. For the support, I think expressing the understanding non-verbally is really important. And then for empathy, I actually didn't really find anything on the active listening observation scale that I felt truly sort of proved that the practitioner was being empathetic. But I do remember that on a lot of the OSCE forms, responding with empathetic responses was really just the way that people were showing that they were being empathetic to their patients as well. So this all seems really obvious. We should listen to our patients. We should be nice to our patients. We should be empathetic to our patients. Like it seems silly that you need to do research on it or think about it more, but it is so hard to do in practice. And I was thinking a lot about why is it so hard? First of all, we are taught to prioritize the medical problem solving. When you go into a practice patient encounter, you have to listen actively, but you're coming out of it with either 3 differential diagnoses, your top 3 tests you want to do, your top 3 imaging tests, lab tests, consultants you want to call, and that's really your goal in mind, is to figure out what the answer is to the question of what is wrong with this patient. In addition, we're also being graded as we practice. We hardly ever have situations until you have first day of intern year where someone is not watching you do this, probably filling out an evaluation form, and you know that you're getting feedback right when it's over. So it does feel like it's a lot more about the feedback you're getting than the actual patient interaction sometimes. Third, we aren't knowledge experts yet. I was a professional musician for 20 plus years, and I've been a doctor for 2.5. And there's just no way to compare the amount of knowledge and comfort you have in the skills in that difference of a time. And I'm sure for some people who were musicians, did other things before medical school, even just had hobbies through their entire life, you feel so much more comfortable doing that thing, whether skiing, snowboarding, whatever it is, than using your medical knowledge. And hopefully we'll get there, maybe in 20 years. And then I think lastly, we just do not realize how much practice we actually need in this. I think it's easy to talk about, it's easy to think about when you're not stressed. And then in the moment, I don't think actively listening to the patient is sort of at the top of any of our lists of what we're doing in that moment. So I was thinking about how we can practice and improve. And I think my frustration with this topic was that I felt like I had learned a lot in music that informed how I listen in medicine, but I just did not know how to translate that for people who aren't musicians. And I didn't know if I was actually doing a good job of remembering that I have this experience and that I can use it in medicine. So I created a list of questions to ask musicians and physicians, the same questions about how they think about listening, do they practice, do they think about listening, in the hopes that the people were more eloquent than I was, and I could actually find things that overlapped that could teach us how to listen better, how to practice, and just how to keep it in the front of our mind more. I actually did this as a research project at the end of medical school, which was cut short by COVID. So I got through the interviews, about half of the interviews before we graduated and started working. So the project was not complete, but I'm still really interested in the topic. And if I were to complete it, I think there's a few caveats that I realized. One, every doctor I talked to, I chose because I greatly respect how empathetic and kind they are. And that was an obvious bias that they've all thought extensively about how they listen and how they approach the patient interview. And I think that's really helpful, but it also doesn't really give a broad spectrum of experience. It was just these people that I admire so much. And then in talking to the musicians, I realized there's a major difference in music and medicine that contributes to how we listen, and that's just time. Musicians spend so much of their time actually practicing the listening portion before they go on stage and perform. And it almost feels like physicians are performing all of the time, and that they don't really get the time to actually practice the listening portion of it before they show up in a patient interview and start performing. So these were the questions that I came up with to ask. It led to some really interesting conversations. And I will say that in not all of the interviews did we actually get through all these questions, because it was like 2 hours in and we were still talking about question number 3. But the questions I came up with to ask were: 1, what does listening mean to you? 2, at moments in your work, do you feel like you were consciously thinking about listening, and what does this look like for you? 3, do you feel like you ever had training on how to listen? 4, what is a way that others respond that indicates to you they are actively listening? 5, what do you feel is something that gets in the way of your ability to actively listen? 6, has your approach to listening changed throughout your career, and how? And 7, if you were to describe an attitude of listening, what would that mean to you? So in a couple minutes, we'll go into some breakout rooms. And I don't think you need to get through all of these questions. I think if there's a question that really jumps out to you that you have thought about, if there's a question that jumps out to you because you've never thought about it, those are sort of the most interesting things, I think. If you have an experience that you've had that you feel like has greatly informed how you listen, I think that's really interesting to talk about and share with people. And I just sort of want to take a few minutes to see what this feels like. But before we do that, because I am a huge nerd and I'm obsessed with Beethoven, I would like us to take a Beethoven break. There's a string quartet. Mac isn't on this call because I think he's on vacation, but he and I are both obsessed with a string quartet called Isidore. They're a young string quartet. They're at Juilliard right now. And they recently won a huge international competition that Mac and I watched the finals of live, like it was like the Super Bowl or something. And this video is from their final round at that competition, actually. So I'm going to drop the YouTube link in the chat. And I've chosen minutes 29 through 34 as my favorite. And I think those 5 minutes of this quartet are also a really wonderful example of 4 people working together and listening and really speaking to each other through their music. And I know that's not going to resonate with everyone. I know that some people watch string quartets and fall asleep immediately, and that is totally okay. If you need 5 minutes to go to the bathroom instead and you're like, Beethoven's not my thing today, that's fine too. But I think until about 9:26, 27, if everybody wants to take 5 minutes to watch either these 5 minutes, minutes 29 through 34, or any 5 minutes, it's 45 minutes long total, so plenty to choose from. And then we'll come back together and go into some breakout rooms. I'm going to drop if I can figure out technology, the questions into the chat at a PDF, so I think you can download it before we go into the rooms. Just those 7 questions. Like I said, choose one question to talk about, choose a couple, just talk about listening in general, and don't answer the questions, but I would just be really curious to know if anybody has experiences that they feel like has informed their listening, or if this is something they've thought about when they're talking to patients, or anything that you think would be helpful to share with a group. So let's do breakout groups actually just for 5 minutes. And then we'll come back together.
Right.
All right. So before we move on to I chose a couple questions that I found really interesting when I was talking to people. But before we go there, I just wanted to give the opportunity for anyone to share if one of these questions brought something up for them that they haven't thought about, if they've been thinking about something a lot recently that has to do with listening. Just give a moment for anyone to share.
I mean, I can go. So the thing that I thought about was, so a couple of days ago, I had a patient. So I'm at the international clinic. And so we see a lot of patients who've experienced trauma. And so my patient required an interpreter, but he also spoke English. And so he would tell the interpreter something, but then he would continue going and telling me stories about his trauma in English as well. And so I was trying to type what the interpreter was telling me and not listening to what he was telling me at the same time, because what he was telling me was also important. but then he would like not convey that information to the interpreter at the same time. And so then after like a couple of minutes later, I had to like just tell myself, stop like typing and just listen to him, because oftentimes he wasn't telling the interpreter the information that he was conveying to me. And then just like listening to him truly like told me more about his story and the trauma that he was reliving. And I think I would have passed that information by just listening to the interpreter and like missing things that were like really important to him.
Yeah. That's so interesting that he was telling you the things that were most important to him in English. I wonder like what made him sort of switch back and forth and think about that. And yeah, John, the computer, we'll talk about it a little bit, but the computer is really like the biggest barrier here. I remember recently I interviewed a patient without being able to log into the computer. It had blocked me out. And so I was like, I don't have time to figure this out. I'm just going to talk to the patient. It was so interesting to go back to like MS1 of like not typing while you talk to a patient. It was really interesting. Yeah, favoring efficiency over listening. I think, yeah, we were talking about that a little bit too in the group I was in, about even just as you get more advanced in your knowledge, how much shorter your patient interview gets. And you sort of walk away realizing you do think less, even about like your open-ended questions, just because you know the information you want to find out, and that's what you're focusing on. And then your patient interview goes from 45 minutes to 10 minutes.
That was actually, I think that was the big thing that we focused on in our group, like the difference between, like kind of shorter visits, listening like less to the patient and more like listening to the presentation or the symptoms or the disease, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And like sometimes having to consciously like switch that over to just like stopping and listening to them and turning away from your computer and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Which I think it was like question 5 or 6, like how has your listening changed over the course of your career? And I feel like as a third year, that difference has become a lot more pronounced for me, just because I feel like we are seeing more patients during clinic days, and I'm also admittedly just kind of tired at the end of residency. But I feel like that's something that I have to like focus on more consciously when there's a patient who like doesn't want to talk about symptoms, they just want to be heard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've definitely noticed that. I feel like there's a switch in my brain when I'm talking to a patient about their symptoms, and then they get a little more emotional about what that means or what that prognosis means. I had a patient in hepatology the other day who we were telling needs to be admitted to the hospital for a feeding tube before he could be worked up for liver transplant. And he stopped sharing his symptoms. Like the interview stopped and he just started talking. And I found myself like totally turning away from the computer, which I guess is what we should do when we need to listen better. But it felt natural because he wasn't talking about his symptoms anymore. But I think even when people continue the interview, there can be moments when they are being more emotional and they are just sharing more and they just want to be heard. And if you don't recognize that, you could still be, turned away typing.
I feel like that physical maneuver where like you actually like turn your chair away from the computer and like lean into the patient, I feel like that's something that we're probably all pretty familiar with at this point. I think we've all I think that's the physician code for, okay, yeah, we're changing gears here.
Yeah, totally. So I had a couple questions in these sets that when I was talking to people, I found really interesting. The first being, did you ever have training on how to listen? Nobody had. No formal training. No one ever had a class. There was no sort of like, this is how we're going to make you a better listener in the musician group or the physician group. But I think there are things we do in music that sort of naturally happen that help us learn how to listen. And a lot of it ends up being taking away this sort of like skills and technique that you're worried and focused on while you're doing this. So like when we're rehearsing string quartets, sometimes you'll have 2 out of 4 musicians play and the other 2 are just sitting there listening. Or to prepare for a string quartet, you might listen to a recording of it while just following along and watching your own part, but not actually playing. And it sort of removes the anxiety and nervousness of your own performance within that and allows you to really just focus on what's happening. Other times we actually will have people sing their parts, not expecting anyone to be any good at it. So it sort of removes the pressure of sounding good while you just sort of sing and see how your parts fit together. I always hated doing that because I'm an absolutely terrible singer, but it does really sort of take you out of this performance feeling and lets you just focus on what's happening. And when I talked to other people, it was really interesting. One of the ways one of my residency friends at NYU had thought about listening was when she was on really long car rides, where I forget where she went to med school, but they had a couple hospitals that were really far apart, and she and her med school classmates would sort of go back, commute back and forth. And on these long car rides, they didn't have distractions. They were just talking about life. And she realized she was so much more focused on the conversation without all these distractions. And it really gave her a chance to sort of practice listening to somebody. And then musicians often do self-recordings. Actually, Dr. Lipkin also asked his patients if he could record their interviews and then listened back to see how he did at listening to them and how he was responding to them. Obviously, HIPAA is a huge thing there, but it's probably in a different time slightly, and he had actually asked permission of all of his patients. And then a lot of people talk about improv classes, either comedy or jazz improv, because you never know what the other person's going to say. You can't sort of pre-plan what you're going to say back to them. And then the other question I found really interesting, which has already come up with the computer thing, what do you feel is something that gets in the way of your ability to actively listen? And far and across the board for physicians, it was technology, EMR problems, just the computer in general. And then the biggest thing across both groups was mood and alertness, which I find interesting as we're all burned out and tired and talking about how to listen to a patient at 3 a.m. in the emergency room that you're admitting to the ICU when you've been awake for who knows how many hours. And then the biggest thing for me that came up was just thinking about what you're going to say next and do next. And in the patient interview, you hear a buzzword and your brain just sort of goes towards what your pertinent positives and negatives are going to be. And then you might just not even realize you're not hearing the rest of what that sentence was from the patient. And so the biggest thing from all of this that I came up with was, how can we get out of our own head? How can we actually bring the focus back to listening instead of worrying about how long we're taking, that I can't seem to order an EKG without the proper indication, otherwise Medicare won't pay for it. All of these things that just come up that take your focus away from actually listening to the patient. And a lot of people that I talked to spoke about meditation. If you ever use the Headspace app and they talk about noting your thoughts, but not really like spiraling and getting into it, that's really helpful. One cardiologist I talked to told me about a book called Looking at Mindfulness, which is about looking at visual art from a mindful perspective that he felt was really helpful in sort of his approach to meditation. Yeah, Christian, I saw that. I don't know how you order an EKG and get it covered these days, but I can't figure it out either. I think another way we can get out of our own head, and I appreciate the confidence from John that as we continue to hone our skills and knowledge, some of this is just going to be easier, and you're not going to be thinking so actively about the questions you have to ask because you'll just know. And I know we're basically out of time, but if anyone has other ideas that they've thought of when they realize they are in that moment with a patient, not actively listening to them, what do you do to get out of your own head, to refocus? Oh,
Right.
interesting.
Oh yeah, I'll just share what I added in the chat was that this made me think a lot about sort of like, I feel like a lot of the training, even if it wasn't sort of specifically listening, the context of motivational interviewing, and I found sometimes that if I like focus on that negative, like, okay, like maybe if I'm like moving part of this visit into motivational interviewing that I feel like my listening skills actually like get better during
Yeah.
the midst of that visit. But I don't know if other folks have had that experience.
Become parents.
I think the other thing that for me that Nikki and I always talk about is just like we a lot of times expect ourselves to be like the best and totally emotionally available and like not like the best relative to other people, like our best. And we also can't always expect that at 3 in the morning we're going to be able to have that. And I think to give ourselves that also space to listen to our own bodies and to where we're feeling, and then to maybe take a check in before we do some of these things, or maybe check in with ourselves after maybe a interaction isn't as positive as we'd want it to be. So basically just the idea of listening to ourselves as well.
Yeah, I actually remember Sarah Bliss, who was a chief a few years ago, told me that her one way she thought about like doing things better, well, that's how she thought about it, I guess, when she felt like she had a bad day, she wasn't doing well, she wasn't listening well, instead of like beating herself up about the stuff she wasn't able to do in that moment, she would just say, what did I learn and what can I change for next time, and sort of like turn it into the positive, but not beat yourself up for that 3 a.m. moment that it's your third admission in an hour and you just can't, you don't have the energy to do everything in that moment.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah,
Yeah.
I just think so much to Luke's point. I was just thinking about the role of self-compassion in this challenge that we have, because medicine is a huge cognitive challenge. We have this cognitive system running the whole time, and we have this humanistic EQ system running, and sometimes they're at odds, they distract from each other. And I think, like, imagine somebody giving you pieces of a puzzle, a really hard puzzle that you're trying to solve, while you're also trying to be a human in that room. That's what doing medicine is. And I think being very transparent in the room with the patient, and even with that bodily turn from the computer saying, wow, I got really caught up on this symptom and how I can keep you safe as your doctor, but like as a person, can we just revisit how this has been for you? Because that matters to me too.
Mhm.
Like I need to solve this problem, but I also want to be a person in this room with you. Like I just think I really believe in being a human in front of your patient, and like even admitting sometimes like, wow, I got caught up on this one detail, but I really care how this has been, and being like telling yourself this is a hard challenge. Like I have to solve this problem and be a human. I think that's really important.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And it's actually something that the cardiologist I talked to for this project spoke to me about was, I don't know, it'd be interesting given John's comment about things get better after residency. I don't know when it felt like for him this came into play, but he felt like once he got to a point where he could focus on the humanistic thing, he actually felt his diagnostic skills, his puzzle skills also just improved. And I don't know if residency is the time when any of us can expect that to feel like it clicks into place. But I think for him, when he felt like he was able to switch the focus back to why I think a lot of us went into medicine, which is patient interactions and caring for humans, he did feel like like his medical knowledge, his puzzle building skills, his differentials, his illness scripts sort of improved because he was able to focus on what was important to him. And so I think that's the point I'd want to leave with. And I know it's hard to think about adding something to what you're doing when you're on, especially on a new rotation, which I think interns will go to new rotations soon. But I think if there was one moment this week where you're talking to a patient and you could think about, am I actually listening to them? If maybe you think about it before you go into the room and you think, if there's a moment where I have the instinct to turn away from the computer, today's the day I'm going to do it. Or if you have a moment after you leave a room to think, what did I do that was actually listening to them? Was I in my own head, or was that an example of where I actually was able to focus on them and think less about what my next patient is going to say to me, or whatever it is. If there's one time this week that we could do that, I think it'd be really interesting to see what people come up with. And if you want more Beethoven videos, if you want to know when Isadora String Quartet is coming to Seattle, it's May 10th. They're playing at Seattle Town Hall. I have tickets. Anyone's welcome to join me. If you want to talk about more about listening, I'm always happy to. Yeah, Kristen. The scribes thing is interesting. And John, I've been told there's videos on YouTube. One of my very last concert ever before post-bac, but I'll let you find it. I'm over my time, so if you have any other questions, I'm obviously here for the rest of academic half day and happy to talk, but thank you guys all for participating and listening.
Thank you so much, Megan, for this really important and really helpful session. Getting a lot of gratitude in the chat